Well, everybody, welcome to the Tuesday, April the 2nd, 2019 session in our series on entrepreneurship and Asian high-tech industries. For Stanford students who are registered for credit, this is 402T, and it's available in 3 different departments: Electrical Engineering, East Asian Studies, and East Asia Language and Culture. So I'm Richard Dasher. I'm the instructor for the course. And I first want to welcome everybody today. Really glad that you would join us. Normally I would be in the room, but as it turns out, I was in Bangkok last week and I'm stopping off in Tokyo on the way back. So we're doing our first session very opportunistically with one of the people who really knows the startup situation in Japan. Before I introduce our speaker, though, I do want to point out that if you're taking the course for credit, be sure you get the syllabus and understand exactly what our requirements are. Basically, you're supposed to attend in person, and there are 2 excused absences from that requirement. If you are registered through the Stanford Center for Professional Development remotely, you don't have to fulfill that requirement, but that's only for those students. There's also a requirement to send me a weekly comment or summary of the session that's brief, 60 to 90 words, and that's due by email to me within 2 weeks of the session. So I look forward to hearing from each of you who are registered within the next couple of weeks. There's 1 excused absence from sending in a comment. So make sure you know what that's going on. Today, your in-person attendance is going to be credited by filling out the survey. And we'd also like all of our guests to fill out the survey as well. These are public seminars. We're delighted to have a mixed audience from the Stanford community and also from the Silicon Valley community. So we're very happy that you're here. Today, I am delighted that our speaker is Mr. Tim Romero. And I see that you see his picture on the screen. Tim is the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of TEPCO Ventures, which is the corporate venture capital arm of Tokyo Electric Power Company. He's probably a lot better known as the founder and main author of the podcast, Disrupting Japan. And I'll let Tim tell more about himself as we get started in this presentation. So what's going to happen is that today, I'll ask Tim to give some prepared remarks, then we'll go into a Q&A session, and hope that you will ask some questions of us. I'll talk more about that when we get to the Q&A.
Fantastic.
Okay, Tim,
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, today I'd rather than give you a lot of numbers and statistics, what I thought I would do is give you a rundown of what I see as the most important aspects about the Japanese startup ecosystem, how innovation happens in Japan, and the unique parts of it and where we think we're going to go from here. And we'll get some Q&A afterwards. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so hopefully we can have a lively discussion afterwards. So at first, I am going to give you some headline numbers to give you a sense of what venture capital is doing in Japan. Now, we'll talk about venture capital. I will give you some numbers, but when I give you numbers, they are to frame a larger point. And it's the larger point I want to communicate. We're going to talk a bit about how startups and enterprise work together, because that is far more important in Japan than it is in the US. Startups are evolving quite differently here, and the way that the innovation is filtering into larger industry and to society as a whole, the mechanisms are different in Japan than they are in the West, and that's pretty interesting. Then we'll cover some recent changes in the startup ecosystem, how things have changed in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years in particular, and wrap up talking about where we go from here, some trends that we see on the ground here that no one else is talking about. And let's get started. But before we do, I suppose I should tell you a little bit about myself and let you know why you should listen to me, at least for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. So briefly, very briefly, I've started 4 startups in Japan over the last 25 years that I've been here. I've sold 2, I've bankrupted 2, so 50-50. It's not bad as far as startups go. I'm currently the CTO of TEPCO Ventures. I teach corporate innovation and entrepreneurship at New York University's Shinagawa campus here. I work with several large Japanese companies on their startup outreach programs. But as Richard mentioned, I'm probably best known for a podcast I run called Disrupting Japan. And it's something I started as a hobby 5 years ago, and it just got out of control and grew much larger than I ever expected it would. We've got, basically I sit down twice a month with Japanese startup founders and I talk with them, not so much about their specific company, but about what it's like to be an innovator in a culture that prizes conformity, what it's like to try to sell to large corporations as a tiny startup. Sometimes things like how they managed to convince their wife to let them quit Mitsubishi and start this crazy little side project. That comes up more than you'd think. And it's all in English, so alcohol is involved in more than a few of these interviews. And the amazing thing, though, is when you talk with startup founders, when you talk with people who are out there building their own companies and making sales every day, you get a really, really different perspective on the future of the Japanese economy and the state of innovation and change than you do when you speak with politicians and academics. And there's a really good reason for that. But that's getting a little away from our discussion today, so
let me jump in a second before you go on, Tim, because I want to say that I cannot emphasize enough how great these interviews are on Disrupting Japan. And one of the things that's done, Tim is one of the key people in the advisory council that runs the Japan-US Innovation Awards each year. And we look at probably 60 or 70 startup companies in Japan to select 5 companies to bring to Silicon Valley every summer. And I think Tim knows at least half of them every year. So, and has interviewed most of the CEOs of the ones that wind up making it into our program. Yeah. So I do want to say that disruptingjapan.com, right?
That's right.
Okay, so I'll let you go on and now talk about the ecosystem today.
Thanks, and yeah, do check it out if you're interested in innovation in Japan. But let's talk venture capital, because that seems to be where most discussions about innovation in Japan start, and sadly where most of them tend to end as well. But it is important. So this shows a total venture capital investment in Japan, and in 2015, the total value of investment exceeded its previous peak that it hit in 2006, and it's been climbing steadily ever since. Now, it's interesting. I've never heard a completely satisfying explanation for this interesting trend you see happening in 2016-17, where despite the number of
So Tim was talking about the number of deals reducing in Japan and the amount of money going into the deals increasing between 2016 and 2017.
Yep.
Why?
Yeah, I think that, well, actually, before I give you my own theory of why we're seeing this happening and why we think it's going to continue, I don't have the 2018 numbers yet. They tend to run about a quarter behind, which means like any minute now we should get them. But these trends seem to be pretty solid and persistent. And before I give you my theory of why we see this happening, I want to talk a little bit about where this money is coming from. So the vast majority of it is coming from Japanese VC and corporate venture capital, and we'll talk more about that in some detail later, but it fundamentally works the same way it does in the West. Crowdfunding provides an unfortunately small amount of capital in Japan compared to the US. Crowdfunding in Japan, there are a few popular crowdfunding sites, but crowdfunding has never been able to shake its image as kind of a social good, as like an NPO, which is how they started in Japan. Another change, and this is important, another source of funding is angel investing, which until about 10 years ago, angel investing in Japan had been lawyers and doctors and other wealthy individuals with money, but no particular startup expertise, investing in startups. Right now is really the very first time we're seeing entrepreneurs who have exited their startups, who have been successful, investing in the next generation of startups and mentoring them. And Silicon Valley, rather than the venture capital making it successful, I think the real key has been that 8 or 9 generations of successful entrepreneurs mentoring the next generation. And we're just seeing that starting in Japan. And I think that's one of the most exciting things and most important things going on here right now. Now, back to why we see this trend going. There's a bit of a barbell problem with investing. So once a startup gets to a growth stage where they've proven their product market fit, they are generating revenues, they've defined and proven their business model, then you've got a model that you can pass off to any halfway intelligent MBA. They can put it in spreadsheets. They can apply a dozen different valuation metrics to it and come out with a value. Now, once a company's in that stage, there's almost unlimited investment available to that company because it's a known model. On the other side, the seed stage, there's almost unlimited investment there as well, because that strategy for investment is you do a little bit of due diligence, you have someone check that the product is plausible, they have a couple of users, they've got some initial traction, and that the team seems solid, and then you write lots and lots and lots of $50,000, $100,000 checks. It's also a relatively easy model. The trouble is that between these two ends, you've got, let's call them $5 million checks. Well, this is too big for people just to write lots and lots of them. If you decide to invest $5 million and that deal goes bad, you're going to have to explain why. And so the fact is, it's still too early to have traction. It's still too early to pull out the spreadsheets. So that part of venture capital between that seed and growth is difficult. It requires people with genuine skill. And that's why we are seeing these trends. And we're actually seeing similar trends globally as well. So it's just more money is pouring into growth and the rest of the pipeline isn't keeping up. But there's something else here that these numbers don't really tell, and I think is more important in the long run. And that is that there's something fundamentally different now than there was during the dot-com era. And that is, there is actually a startup ecosystem, by which I mean, one thing that didn't really happen before was that we had, in the dot-com era, usually the startups, of which mine was one, we were looking for large corporate partners, almost like a sponsor. And that was fine. But now there's enough startups where they're actually doing business with each other, where a large part of the startup revenues are coming from other startups. And this lets innovation propagate much, much faster than having to convince a large corporation, simply because startups will take more risks. They'll move faster. And it allows startups to sell innovative business solutions much quicker. This is total investment from the US and Japan. Now, even if we adjust for the size of the population or the size of the economy, the US invests about 10 to 15 times as much as Japan does. And actually, it's a little worse than this, because the way Japan defines venture capital investment is looser than the way it's defined in the US. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that Japan needs more investment? Well, if you talk to VCs, they'll always tell you that there's way too much money in the market and that the startup prices are far too high, but they'll always tell you that. I have never talked to a VC at any time in the last 25 years where they were not complaining that startups were overpriced. Now, founders will always tell the opposite, of course. Now, my own sense is that there's about as much money available in Japan as can be sensibly deployed. In fact, if anything, there's maybe a little bit more money available that can be sensibly deployed in Japan. So the investment gap is huge, but what does that mean? Why is that important? The goal is not to copy what's worked in the United States. If Japan doubled the amount of venture capital available, there'd be nowhere to put it. But there's clearly room for growth. And in Japan now, we've got over 15 startups that have raised more than $50 million. And we have 2 unicorns, well, technically 1 unicorn since Mercari IPO'd. Now, frankly, I don't really like unicorn counting as a method of measuring innovation. Right now there are 280 unicorns in the world. 10 years ago, there were 0. Does that mean we're 280 times more innovative? No, of course not. China has far more unicorns than the United States. That doesn't mean China is more innovative. There are kind of macroeconomic trends that are more responsible for the existence of unicorns than the innovation. But that said, any ecosystem is going to have to develop businesses that scale. If innovation is meaningful, it has to have a real impact long term, whether that is through IPO or whether that is through B2B sales or consumer sales. Well, let's talk a bit about startup and enterprise collaboration, because in Japan, this is a major way that innovation does get propagated into society as a whole. Now, there are the 4 primary means of collaboration that when I'm working with my corporate clients, these are the 4 ways I generally steer them in terms of interacting with startups. And we'll talk briefly about each of them, but corporate venture capital, where the companies actually invest in startups, acquisitions, where they purchase them, accelerators and open innovation programs, where they work directly with startups to try to foster either an acquisition at the end or a joint marketing or collaboration projects, and co-development projects, where a large enterprise will outsource a key component of its technology or its product to startups, which is more common in Japan than you might imagine. Certainly more common in Japan than in the US. Now, there's actually 9 means of collaboration, but the 5 on the right side, or I guess the left side, the side on the 5 side, don't really work well in Japan. And the reason for that is a much longer discussion, and we can dive into it in Q&A if you're interested. But the 4 on the 4 side are the ones that really work. Now, before I dive into these mechanisms of innovation sharing, of how startups and enterprise work together, I think it's important to explain how much things have changed in Japan over the last 10 years, or certainly over the last 20, particularly in the attitude of the way large enterprises view startups. So I started my first company in Japan in 1998. And at that point, if I wanted to work with a large company, if I wanted to work with a Mitsubishi or a Toyota, I would be pushed down through 3 levels of subcontractors before there would be any chance to work with them at all. So innovation just almost by definition could not move up that supply chain. Now, this has totally changed. Today, almost every major corporation has at least one team that is focused on reaching out to startups and trying to find innovation. Now, what's changed? There's a lot of government programs, there's a lot of educational programs, but to be honest, I think the single biggest effect in changing the way that Japanese companies think about startups and innovation has been the government of Japan. The Prime Minister of Japan himself, Prime Minister Abe, has gone on stage several times and said, startups are the future of Japan. We need this innovation to revitalize Japan. And the first time he did that, probably the next day, the CEO of every major company in Japan was saying, what is this startup stuff and why aren't we doing it? And there's lots of, all the programs and things that are run, I think are good, but I think that the government of Japan has been very good at just shining a spotlight on startups and saying this is worth paying attention to. After that, the collaboration started. There was a few successful case studies, and it's been gathering steam ever since. The other thing I think has happened is the government of Japan has said clearly that they're not backstopping big companies anymore. When Sharp was allowed to be purchased by a foreign company, I think that sent some shockwaves through corporate Japan. A lot of people were just assuming that the Japanese government would always bail out the large companies. They would find someone to merge them with. They would make sure those jobs were protected. And that didn't happen. And so a lot of unprofitable companies now are, the CEOs have to figure out how to make profit, how to turn their company around. It really lit a fire under their ass. And this is good for Japanese startups. It's good for Japanese innovation. It is also really wonderful for foreign companies who are trying to enter the Japanese market, because that same attitude, that same welcomeness to innovation works whether the innovation is coming from inside Japan or outside Japan. All right, let's take each one of these mechanisms individually and quickly. So first, corporate venture capital. This is, I think most of the class knows how this works. It is just large companies investing in startups with the hope that they will learn a bit about the startups and perhaps collaborate with them. In practice, this is about the least effective way for large companies to interact with startups, both in Japan and globally, but particularly in Japan, because the way corporate venture capital is run, they tend to hire people with a background in banking and venture capital, but who don't really understand the business that they're running, and more importantly, don't have the political clout within the large organizations to get different divisions to work with these startups. So some venture capital funds are profitable, but very few have had the intended effect of letting these startup innovations filter into the larger organization. Acquisitions. This is something that's new in Japan. I mean, not acquisitions themselves, but until very recently, M&A has always been distressed assets in Japan. Large companies would acquire another company when they could pick up assets or customers at fire sale prices, or when the government kind of forced a merger upon them. Strategic M&A is a relatively new concept. We've seen a handful of acquisitions. Most of the acquisitions that happen in Japan are $10 million to $30 million range, which is still, it's not Silicon Valley IPO money, but is still incredibly motivating to a potential founder to be able to work on something really hard for 7 years and walk away with $8 million in their pocket. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing so much new startups happening. Now, I don't think, my clients and people I talk to, everyone is talking a good game about M&A. Everyone understands the theory that strategic M&A is a way to further their business and a lower risk way of rolling out new products. But there's been very little motion on that. It's just starting to take off now. And I don't ever think that we'll see strategic M&A in Japan the way we do in the US, which is, the American corporations do this better than anyone in the world. So they will be able to say, okay, we want to enter market X. Who are the top 3 private companies in this space? 6 months from now, we're going to buy one of them. I don't think that'll ever happen in Japan. I think we're going to see more long-term collaborations. But again, the most important thing is that the strategic acquisitions are happening, and that's providing a real incentive for people to start companies. Now, actually, one thing I do want to talk about with the acquisitions, this is one part where venture capital in Japan is different than the US. Without getting into it too deeply, Japanese venture capital, the entire industry is set up to have lots of low-value, low-risk IPOs. So as in the US, you might have a VC firm that understands that 9 out of 10 investments are going to be worthless, and 10% are going to provide really high return. In Japan, it's traditionally worked the other way, where they understand 10% of their investments are going to go bankrupt, and 90% of them will provide a nice 2x, 3x return at IPO. This is starting to change because the large traditional Japanese VCs are losing deal flow. Foreign money and foreign strategy has come into Japan, and they're outbidding the traditional VCs on the most promising new technology companies. So we're seeing a slow change to that. But as a result, a lot of traditional VCs still try to push their portfolio companies to IPO early and safely. But some of the more powerful startup founders in Japan, and I've talked with a number of them on the show, have fought with their investors and just said, no, we're going to stay private longer. If you want to be part of the next round, that's great. If you don't, that's okay too. So it's changing. And probably the most well-known acquisition was last year, or 2 years ago now, was KDDI's $200 million acquisition of Soracom. And that sort of woke everyone up. Corporate accelerators, they're a little bit different in Japan than they are in the United States. What is called a corporate accelerator in Japan tends to be called an open innovation program in the US. Again, I think this goes back to the different approach to acquisitions. There are a number of companies, a number of very promising Japanese startups who their entire marketing strategy depends on working with and trusting large Japanese companies long-term. So these might be innovative imaging companies like LPixel, who is using, LPixel is using AI and imaging of MRI scans to detect potential diseases. Their entire marketing strategy is to partner with device manufacturers. They're not reaching out to doctors. And this is really common in Japan. Whereas in the US, even as an American, that strikes me as incredibly dangerous. I don't think I could allow that to happen. I'd want to have the direct relationship with the end user. But it's working in Japan. These long-term, both ways trust relationships do seem to be stable and productive. And I think they might end up in M&As in 5 years or 10 years. And why that is another deep dive that we won't get into today. The last is co-development projects. This is actually similar to open innovation and continues on the same point I was talking about, that there is this relationship of trust between enterprise and startup, supplier and vendor that can last for many, many years and many, many budgeting cycles. And it's allowing the ecosystem to develop differently here than it is in the US. But all is not well. So I've worked with both startups and enterprises in every single one of these models. And it can, and sometimes it is incredibly productive. But I'd say the biggest problems that plague these collaborations is in communication and expectation. There's kind of an impedance mismatch between startups and enterprise companies. And it's just things like, on the enterprise side, I've got to, I don't know how many times I've had this conversation, which is basically, okay, now when the startups talk about testing and Q&A, they mean something completely different than when you talk about testing and Q&A. They're not lying to you, but that's really what Q&A is in the startup world. And on the flip side, I spent a lot of time working with startups saying like, no, when he said he'll get back to you with an answer in 2 weeks, he's not blowing you off. He's not trying to get rid of you. It really probably takes him a week to get an appointment with his own boss. So most of the times when things fall apart, it falls apart for those kind of communication reasons, or when the large enterprise doesn't really know what it wants. A lot of times these programs are developed by committee, and the goal is basically to go out and get some of that innovation and bring it back. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on this particular topic, and I think it's time well spent, because I think the major mechanism for innovation in Japan is going to be through this startup enterprise collaboration that won't exist nearly as much in the US. So let's talk about startups. But before I do, so everyone loves to talk about startups and trends and how things are changing and how this uniquely affects Japanese culture. But before we go into the culture argument, I want to explain my view on culture. Now, when I say culture is bullshit, I don't mean things like food and language and history. Obviously, that's real. The bullshit culture I'm talking about is when we use culture as an excuse to explain anything that we cannot understand. So, well, why aren't there as many startups in Japan? Well, that's just a risk-averse culture. Or why is this decision-making so hard? Well, that's just the corporate culture. No. I think it's far more productive to view things in terms of risks and rewards, in terms of kind of game theory. So if you want to know why there are so many more startups in Japan today than there were 30 years ago, don't look for stories about culture. Look at the risks and rewards. So let's teleport back 30 years, and we have a promising new graduate from Tokyo University. Now, he has the option of going to work for a big company or starting his own company. If he goes to work for a big company, he's guaranteed lifetime employment. If he does a good job, he'll have steady large promotions for the next 30 years. If he does a bad job, he'll have steady small promotions for the next 30 years. It's a high respected position. If he starts his own company, well, at that point, there were very little M&A, so his only hope is to IPO that firm. And if he does IPO the firm, his financial rewards and his social status is about the same as a senior executive at a Mitsubishi or a large bank. But if it doesn't work, well, he doesn't get a second chance. He can't get hired into another company. And the bankruptcy laws, particularly at that time, meant he'd be carrying those debts around for his entire life. So going into a big company was all reward and no risk. Starting your own company was hugely risky with very little reward. So everyone made the perfectly rational decision to go work for big companies. Well, fast forward to today, and let's look at that equation again. Lifetime employment, unless you're working for the government, no longer exists. You're no longer guaranteed a steady stream of promotions. You could very well be in your late 40s and the company could fire you, or you could get sold to a foreign company and have them fired. But on the other hand, starting your own company, You no longer have to take out loans. There's plenty of risk capital available. You're not staking your whole life on one decision. Furthermore, certainly into your early 30s, there's a lot more job mobility. You can get a new job if you screw up. And more importantly, the risk. We're seeing M&A. We're seeing the ability to really work hard for 5 years, 6 years, and walk away with $6-7 million if all goes right. So now joining a big company has become less rewarding and more risky, and starting your own company has become less risky and more rewarding. So people are making the perfectly rational decision to start more startups. Now, you can call that culture if you like. But the way I look at it, I mean, if you want to change the culture, change the risks and rewards, and people will adjust their behavior. So with all that kind of out of the way, and I find looking at risks and rewards to be a lot more demystifying than trying to come up with cultural stories. But let's look at some of the most important trends. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I realize we're running out of time. So first, I think is a change of the general social attitude towards startups and innovation. One of the biggest influencers here I've mentioned has been Prime Minister Abe and the Abe government in general, just saying good things about startups. Another, strangely, was the movie The Social Network. That was really what put startups into Japanese social consciousness. And to give you an idea how bad it was, at my first company, there was a new grad from, I think he was from Waseda, that I really wanted to hire. And he wanted to join my company, but his mom was saying, no, we're not going to let him do that. And so I had to go meet mom. It was hard to hire back then, let me tell you. And so I explained to her what my company did, and she didn't understand this whole startup thing. She was like, so wait, you're getting this money from these people, and then you're going to go sell it to these other people for like 20 times more in a few years. It sounded like a scam to her. And he did end up joining the company. I had to meet mom twice. I don't have to do that anymore. Everyone understands how startups work, and it's generally viewed as a good thing. We're seeing specific cities that I consider startup hotspots in Japan. Now, Tokyo is by far the biggest, but I think two of the most creative and interesting places in Japan are Fukuoka and more recently, Kyoto. And I think it's important. Silicon Valley did not come into existence in New York or Chicago or DC. And I really believe you need a certain distance away from political and financial power to really innovate and to really create something that is visionary. And so if you want to look at something that's really interesting in Japan and that are developing their own ways, those are two cities to look at. Another thing is the high quality founders we're seeing. So as Richard mentioned earlier, with the Japan Society Awards, we've been doing this for 8 years now?
9 years.
9 years. Until last year, there was always this gap between the quality of the Japanese startups and the quality of the San Francisco startups. And it was something that, at least on the Japan side, we were always a little self-conscious about. But I think last year was really the first time, at least the first time that I sat there realizing, like, no, these are, for their age and their, how long they've been in business, I'd put these Japanese firms, I'd stack them up against the best of anywhere in the world. So the Japanese founders have learned incredibly fast. And another thing that's interesting is the number of women entrepreneurs in Japan. And I think as a percentage, there are more female founders in Japan than there are in the United States. And I haven't actually counted, but I think about 1/5 of my guests on Disrupting Japan are women. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Rather than going into in depth, I want to tell you what 2 different female founders have told me as what they believe the reason for this is. And they've said that it is actually easier in Japan to start a company, to start a startup as a woman. Because if you go to a really good school and you're a man, that comes with some really heavy social expectations. Your parents and the rest of your family, their status depends on how well you do and what company you go into, and everybody's watching. But if you're a girl, well, then your parents are much more likely to say, oh yeah, that startup thing, that sounds fun. Go do that for a few years. And I think there is something to that, but we are seeing a lot of really high quality women founders in Japan. So my last thought I want to leave you with is butterflies. So why butterflies? The Japanese, let's call it Japanese power structure, whether it's industry or senior academics or people in government, they're looking to startups as a way to generate innovation, generate economic activity. And they're doing that. But what they really want is to generate economy and economic activity without changing anything. And that's not going to happen. That can't happen. So why butterflies? If you release butterflies into a forest where there's never been any butterflies before, you don't have the forest plus butterflies. You have something different. Those butterflies are going to eat some plants that weren't being eaten before. There's going to be other things that are going to be able to eat them and thrive that couldn't before. The ecosystem as a whole is going to be thrown out of balance for a little bit. And it's going to evolve into something stronger and something different. And something different in a very unpredictable way. And I think that's where we are in Japan right now. So I'd like to open this up for Q&A, and thanks for inviting me. I really enjoy it. Please check out the podcast and follow me on social media if you like.
So thanks very much for coming today, and please join me in thanking Tim for a great presentation.
Thank you.